Good afternoon, boys and girls. So I thought that would be it. So, of course, the question often is, why do we have quality assurance anyway? Why do we need it? In Canada, as I suspect in a lot of places, there are right reasons to do it, but government gets inspired very often by newspaper headlines. And newspaper headlines causes reaction from government. And there are some that have occurred in Canada in the last little while that I wanted to share with you. Infections, control lapses, new rules to police cosmetic surgery, College of Teachers in British Columbia because of all kinds of standards-related issues and non-compliance. They were, of the regulatory body, they were disbanded. There were issues in Canada with Insurus, where a supervisor is appointed who happens to be sitting here, Deanna Williams, where the registrar was dismissed and the council responsible to the supervisor. We've also had headlines around hospitals, top medical doctors cautioned after patient's death, secretly, slow progress on standards, secrecy. Sometimes I just thought I'd share a few with you where the media actually, and government sometimes, and most of the media gets it wrong. So I thought this was kind of cute. Headline recently in the paper, meeting on open meetings closed. Another one, study shows frequent sex enhances pregnancy chances. The media doesn't get it so right. My favorite is this one, marijuana issue sent to a joint committee. So absolute true headlines. This is a kind of a newspaper focusing in. Parents keep kids home to protest school closures where teachers were on strike. And then desperation of hospitals. They resort to hiring doctors, imagine that. And something that you would think doesn't need newspaper comments, but newspaper, after I'm sure a lot of research shows, homicide victims rarely talk to police. So, these are headlines that does get government action and government imposing will sometimes on regulatory bodies to respond. It's always good to ask the question, what does it mean to be in Canada self-regulated? That's our model. At least when I left Canada was. When I get back, I'm not sure it still will be, but that's the model. And of course, the simple answers we all know are accountability, regulating in the public interest, and improving patient outcome. I'm going to skip through some slides just to get to the crux of what we do in Ontario in dentistry. The quality assurance model in Ontario requires continuing education or professional development, which everybody has, peer and practice assessments, which everybody does very traditionally, and a mechanism for a regulatory body, a college, to monitor its members' participation and compliance. Everybody has two key components. We actually have interpreted peer assessment in the second one. Continuing education everybody has. For us, peer review is a practice enhancement tool. It has some interesting features to it, never to be confused with what I understand revalidation to be, never be confused with a blunt instrument. It's philosophically, it is not linked at all to the discipline process, or in UK parlance, I suppose, the fitness to practice system. We expect it to move beyond what we used to have in traditional quality assurance programs, namely office visits where inspectors would go in with a clipboard and a checklist and would go through to see whether there was compliance. And so we felt we would look at some different ways of doing that, doing assessments. And we felt it should be meaningful, nurturing, and non-punitive. And so our solution was to have certain assumptions, recognizing that most of the practitioners are competent, who wish to constantly and continuously upgrade their skills. We also recognize that our program should meet the changing demands of changing practices, environments, patient needs. And we also wanted to ensure that members can and do demonstrate their continued competency. I'm going to skip through the educational piece. Everybody has it in a world that has regulation, whether it's self or otherwise, to a greater or lesser extent. Most systems have different qualities of continuing education, including what we've been calling core courses. And that is not so unique to us. What is unique to us, I think, I'll just race through that. I understand all of this is posted anyway on the PSA website, or will be at some point. This is not too different from what people know and have. What we have, which we think is a little different, is what we call our PET, a practice enhancement tool. It's a self-administered computer-based assessment program, and it allows dentists to evaluate their practice, knowledge, skill, and judgment based on peer-derived standards. The practice enhancement tool was developed in conjunction with our national examining body, the University of Toronto Faculty of Education, and selected dentists and public members from our council and dentists in the profession. It's for the dentist, it's easily accessible from any computer with an internet connection. There is a huge bank of questions which vary, but there are 200 multiple choice questions, each addressed to 6 basic competencies in dentistry. And we're now working on enhancing the competencies so that we add to them and rotate them in and out. The questions are based on a knowledge foundation that we think is required for all dentists. We've also used some of the questions, or had questions developed based from our complaints and discipline process, our fitness to practice process. So we weren't just sort of dealing in a vacuum. And we also extracted experiences, commonalities, frequencies of occurrences from the insurance program, the professional liability program. It enables dentists to evaluate and assess practice based on peer review standards. And the program is designed that it kicks out or identifies areas which need improvement as the dentist goes through and completes the PET. It's not just an exercise to get through it and satisfy the college's requirements, but in the program design, it will identify where the dentist could do better, where the dentist may have missed some areas, and it may even be with those who are successful in it. Just because someone may score, say, a 75 overall, just to pick a number, we'd be interested to let the dentist know about where the 25% might be improved. It's not a question of giving them the answers, it's a question of trying to promote further educational experience, directing them to perhaps resource material where they might improve their knowledge base. They have all kinds of time to complete. They have 30 days to complete. It's not with the clock ticking this against them. They're able to look things up. They're able to talk to their friends to try to collaborate and come up with approaches. Our feeling being that if it's an educational and assessment tool, nothing wrong in the educational model being applied to the actual taking tool. There's log off and log in and log off provisions, saving answers, going back and changing answers. I won't go through the questions. I did some samples here, but just to show you what it might look like. A question might be something like that. There's case studies where there are radiographs, some analysis. Questions that we think every dentist should really be able to answer, whether they're a specialist or not, anybody who's in practice. What we do as the regulatory body is that as the program may identify a need for improvement, or the dentist wishes to have improvement, we'll provide staff people who will help interpret results, identify appropriate continuing activities to address weaknesses, suggest resources that may support and complement the professional development. What's interesting is that it's not linked to registration, it's not linked to renewal, it's not linked to complaints, not linked to discipline. The only provision in the regulation is that the dentist has to cooperate. So arguably, if a dentist gets 0, we would not link it. We would make sure and do our best to have it. It's the theory, to have our dentists improve in what it is that they're doing. What we have found is interesting. We now have a robust study done by University of Toronto, who's been following the program. We have 2,500 dentists who've gone through it. And what we have found is that dentists who have taken it and where there are areas where they're showing lapses or they're showing lack of knowledge, as they're directed to materials, resources, or courses, when they retake the PET the second time, they shine. There has been no example of anybody that's retaken it. And again, remember, the questions are not identical. There's a bank of them, and I forget the number, but that you will. It's not possible to get the same bank of questions every time you do it. So our statistical study is for those who have not done well or who wish to improve. On the second time, they do well and they do improve. We've also found there's some other interesting sidelights that have happened. We found that more study groups have popped up all around the province, where dentists have figured out, well, look, we've got to do this thing anyway. Maybe what we'll do is, since we have 30 days, we'll form a study group. And some may suggest that, well, they're cooking the answers as they collaborate, but really what happens in the discussion is valuable. I've attended only 2 of those groups. The answers are not so simple. Even the most experienced practitioner will need to spend probably at least 15 hours with the practice enhancement tool. It means they're going to have to look things up. It means they're going to have to refresh their knowledge base. Some things they may know right away, but not everything. And so in the study groups, it's interesting as the dentists around the table begin to discuss what the solution is to the problem that's put before them. And there often isn't consensus. And sometimes they send somebody back and say, let's come back next week, you go look this up and come back and tell us. So that's been a very good development. A side development to it is that we find that 1.5% of the membership has told us, they're happy to practice. These are people over 70, as the statistics tell us. They're happy to practice as long as no one's watching what they're doing. But the moment they've got to sort of go through knowledge-based kind of assessment, they're going to pack it in. So we have 1.5% of those who've taken it retired. It's not such a bad thing. It may in fact be a good thing. I think there was a study we heard about in Miami last year involving medicine where practitioners who are over 65 tend to require a little more, I wouldn't say revalidation, but a little more scrutiny on their knowledge base and how they practice. So we're excited about this. Statistically, as we would have expected, 4% of the membership overall don't do well the first time. I would have thought the numbers would have been higher, but at 4%, you know, it is kind of encouraging. It may mean that on the other end, on the continuing education programs that they're required to take, they're actually taking stuff that helps them with their practice. So that's, I think my time is up, and that's pretty much what I wanted to share.
Thank you very much. I think in order just to keep to time and to have a bit of discussion at the end, I think it would be helpful, with your permission, just to carry on and have the next presentation just now, and then we can have some joint questions at the end. So I'm going to get this wrong, you know, so it gives me great pleasure to also introduce to you Ellen Schafthotel. From Manchester Pharmacy School, who's going to speak to us about the impact of pharmacy regulation on pre-registration training.
I can find it. Oh, there it is, yes. So I just want to give a bit of background. I think, well, there was a presentation earlier about pharmacy, so you're familiar with pharmacy and pharmacy regulation, so I'll go over that briefly. But I want to draw on two studies that we've undertaken at Manchester and just draw out some parallels, specifically focusing on work-based learning for pharmacy technicians and pharmacists, and compare between those two professional groups of pharmacy professionals, but also across the sectors within which they train, and then kind of make some concluding comments and observations about what came out of those studies. So just by way of background, and I, as I said, can hopefully go over this relatively quickly because it was said in the morning session, around the General Pharmaceutical Council is somewhat unusual in that they actually regulate two professional groups, but also pharmacy premises, and set standards for all of those. So in particular, what I'm going to focus on here is the standards that they set around education and training here. First of all, pharmacists are, as you hopefully know, a very established profession, have been regulated for a very long time. At the moment, they undertake a 4-year, mainly university-based undergraduate master's degree, which is then followed by 1 year in practice in mostly the two main sectors of pharmacy, which is community and hospital pharmacy. And then we've got this other group of support staff pharmacy technicians who are actually, as a regulated and registered profession, a very recent addition to the pharmacy team and what comes under the General Pharmaceutical Council. They undertake 2 years work-based training. It's kind of like an apprenticeship type model, where they also undertake 2 types of qualification, a knowledge-based qualification and a competency-based qualification. And then here the box on the right-hand side with pharmacy premises is empty on purpose, because it's about thinking about regulation, that the regulator puts standards in place for premises, but actually there's not an awful lot in there that specifies what needs to be in place in terms of pharmacy premises. Once both professions are registered, they can practice in a whole range of different sectors, community and hospital obviously being the biggest sectors, but also pharmacists and pharmacy technicians go into industry, academia, regulatory, professional bodies and so on. And it's that work-based training bit of the education and training for both professions that I want to concentrate on. And I'm drawing on 2 pieces of work. One piece is a piece of work that was undertaken by a PhD student, Sam G, who actually looked longitudinally over the pharmacist pre-registration training, so that's 12 months that the pharmacist following their 4-year degree spends in practice. And he had 20 pairs of trainee pharmacists and their tutors that he followed to the point beyond registration and took qualitative interviews with them at various points throughout their pre-registration training, and he also did a large survey with them right near the end of their training. The other study that I want to draw on is a very recently concluded study that was commissioned by the General Pharmaceutical Council to undertake to look at the quality of education and training for pharmacy technicians, because they are such a new profession. And we did a whole range of interviews with course providers. There's different types of course providers, further education colleges, distance providers. We also actually went into the employing organisations, again as a community and hospital pharmacy, speaking to people that are in overall charge of training within those organisations, but also pharmacists that look after the individual training of pharmacy technicians. Also involved the awarding bodies that award those qualifications that pharmacy technicians can at the end. And we also did a large survey of recently registered pharmacy technicians. So I want to, going through, draw on those pieces and kind of pull out some comparisons, some parallels, but some differences. Just to give you an overview of the background. In the studies, we had 2,500 pharmacy pre-registration trainees, and for the survey, we did a census of basically the 12-month period of recently registered pharmacy technicians once they recently joined the register, of about nearly 1,500. The reason we didn't go to trainees like we did with pharmacists was that actually until they joined the register, nobody really knows how many are out there and how many actually exist. Similar picture that the largest sector in community pharmacy is community pharmacy, and that's where the largest number in both groups of the professions actually undertook their training. Highly feminised workforce, in particular pharmacy technicians, but also pharmacists. Looking at their ethnic background, somewhat different in that pharmacists for a long time actually relatively high, in particular background from Asian, Indian background, whereas pharmacy technicians more white. In terms of ages, as you'd expect, pharmacy students coming out of school going into their training, whereas in hospital and community, some differences, where apprenticeship model coming out of college, going in early on into the career of pharmacy technicians, and in community, where people who had been dispensers and had other roles within an organisation and actually encouraged to undertake training. So looking specifically at the work-based training, so as I said, with pharmacists it's their 5th year before they register, and for pharmacy technicians it's 2 years while they're also undertaking these qualifications. So the knowledge training that pharmacists would have had has happened at university. For both groups, they actually have a pharmacist supervising them, also pharmacy technicians, and for pharmacists that supervisor is called a tutor. In terms of the training sites, there's really relatively minimal requirements in both groups that need to be met. But looking at how assessment works and how competency is assessed is, for pharmacy technicians, very varied. There are some observations and assessments through observations that through peripatetic assessors that go in, written pieces, they produce a portfolio. Actually, that variation depends on who the awarding body is and who the provider of training is. So in particular, those who train in hospitals will be much more likely to actually use further education colleges for their training, and in community pharmacy much more common for that to be provided at a distance by a distance provider. So a huge variation of training providers. For pharmacists specifically, through that last work-based training year, they've got performance standards against which they kind of get signed off that they need to achieve. There's 72 of those. At the end, there's a national set, a registration assessment that's set by the General Pharmaceutical Council. And then in terms of training structure through that work-based learning, based on the performance standards for pharmacists, there are weekly sign-offs by their tutor. So the tutor is the person who supports them to learn, but they also kind of assess them in formal appraisal type meetings, at the end of which they sign them off as having achieved against so many of the performance standards. And really that's not the structure that exists in pharmacy technician imposed through the General Pharmaceutical Council at least. Looking at some of the sector differences now, but actually commonalities between pharmacists and pharmacy technicians in their training. So the location, obviously, I got a colleague to look over these slides, but well, it's obvious that they're based in hospitals. But the point that I was trying to make here is that actually they're not just based in pharmacy premises, but they're going out across the whole hospital. They're going on wards. Through that, their exposure is obviously to more complex patients and more complex needs, but they're actually working with more than one trainee, but also healthcare professionals, not just pharmacists. Pharmacy technicians see how other pharmacy technicians work. Pharmacists see pharmacists at various levels of seniority, but have also got that whole exposure to other types of healthcare professionals that they see when they're training on different wards and different rotations. That's very different in community pharmacy, where obviously the training site is the community pharmacy. There's very little outside of that going on. The exposure is obviously more to primary care needs and also over-the-counter treatments, minor ailments. In both, the supervisor is a pharmacist, but here it's really the only pharmacist that the trainee or the pharmacy technician sees. In community pharmacy, in particular pharmacy technicians, there's very often no other pharmacy technician in that pharmacy. They're the one in training, so there's not really role models to look to. So it's a relatively small team, and the tutor has a very, very central role. And there is a bit of something in there around professional isolation or worry that that might be happening. So just to look beyond registration of pharmacy technicians now, pharmacy technicians of course continue working under a supervision of a pharmacist, and they work with other pharmacy support staff. Other pharmacy support staff are not regulated in the same way. Just looking at from our survey, we asked something around career progression or entering into practice, and of course in hospital pharmacy there's much more of an kind of established career structure for pharmacy technicians. They come out as a day one pharmacy technician, but then there's routes for specialising. They actually have higher salaries than do community pharmacy technicians. And actually in community pharmacy, what creates problems is that there is not very much clarity on what the role of a pharmacy technician actually is. Whilst that's relatively clear in hospital pharmacy, it's not so clear how they differ from the other types of support staff. And it came through many of the qualitative comments that actually the qualification that pharmacy technicians undertook wasn't quite high enough for what was needed in hospital, but actually was far too much for what they wanted in community pharmacy. For pharmacists, looking at their preparedness for practice from the PhD project, the location is very similar to what I said earlier on. They continue to working with different types of support staff and healthcare professionals. Actually, a key thing is this day one pharmacist. Unlike pharmacy technicians who will always continue working under the supervision of a pharmacist, in hospital pharmacy there's a whole network of people around pharmacists, other pharmacists, but also other healthcare professionals who they can go to for advice. Whereas actually as a qualified pharmacist, they are the sole, they're kind of the buck stops with them from day one, and there isn't a formal structure around them. There's no formal structure for training beyond this, as there would be in medicine, FY1, FY2, and so on. So just to conclude, There is quite a lot of variation in the training provided, in particular for pharmacy technicians, but there's also quite a bit of difference between the sectors, and of course pharmacists do go, they're able to practice in any sector. So there's questions that were thrown up in the both projects, I suppose, around quality and ensuring parity, and for the standards against which the different providers or sectors are approved to be up to date and flexible, and actually making sure that the outcomes that I said can be achieved, and kind of what the role of the regulator is, how far they should be going. And I know that they are looking at revising standards, and pharmacy education is undergoing change as well to make it into a more integrated 5-year programme.
Thank you very much. Well, just before, for our last session for the afternoon, I think we'll just move on and then have a conversation rather than a question and answer session. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Marie Price, who's going to speak to us about the General Medical Council and its fitness practice procedures and decision-making processes.
So I'm going to give an overview of a piece of work we've done last year, a review of decision making in the General Medical Council's fitness to practice procedures. And this work was conducted between April and December last year. So I'm going to introduce the work briefly, talk a little bit about the research design methods that we used, give an overview of the analyses and the findings, really. And sort of by happy accident, the full report on this has been published today on the GMT website, as it happens, so it is available for everyone now. So this work was commissioned by the GMC and carried out by our research group CAMRA in Plymouth. And really, this work was kind of preceded by a full-scale quantitative analysis by Charlotte Humphrey at King's College, which was published in the BMJ in 2011. And really, Charlotte Humphrey's findings showed that certain demographic cohorts of doctors proceed further through fitness to practice procedures and also receive sort of higher impact sanctions. They're sort of more likely to receive higher impact sanctions at the outset, and that's kind of black minority ethnic doctors and international medical graduates in particular. And so kind of part of the GMC's reasoning for commissioning this work was to sort of follow up on that. So this was an in-depth qualitative review to look in some detail at the GMC's decision-making processes to see if any of their kind of activity might be contributing to those trends, because obviously we're here today to talk about impacts, and if regulators' own activity were kind of contributing to disproportionality in that way, that would have a very significant impact on confidence in the regulator, potentially from both the profession and from the public. So the GMC had a number of aims for this project, and we kind of formulated those around these 3 research questions. Does decision making in the GMC's FDP procedures function as intended? What factors within the GMC's own activity might contribute to the overrepresentation of certain groups within the FDP procedures and their progress through it? And what were the institutional and professional discourses which shape decision making in the FDP procedures? So we focused on 3 key decision points in the procedures, which you can maybe just about see on that diagram there. The triage point, which is where complaints or referrals first enter the system, and the GMC triages them to establish are they even potentially a fitness to practice matter. There is then what is sometimes referred to as stream 2 in the fitness to practice procedures, which is where the GMC doesn't feel that of itself a particular complaint or referral constitutes a fitness to practice matter, but if it were to be found to be part of a pattern of ongoing behaviour, then it would. So they refer it to an employer to see if they've got any further information about that doctor's practice. Obviously, information then comes back from the employer, and the GMC makes a second decision about whether to open a full investigation, whether to close it. And the third key decision point is what's sometimes called the stream 1 or the end of full investigation, and that's where something has been open for a full fitness to practice investigation, and there's a decision at the end of that investigation as to whether it should be closed, whether there should be some form of warning. Sometimes undertakings are agreed to limit the doctor's practice in some way, or it can then be referred on to a fitness to practice panel. And those decisions are usually made by case examiners who, and we looked at their activity quite closely in this review. So as I said, this was a qualitative review, and that really is driven by the textual nature of which of the data in these case files and the nature of our research questions. So we use thematic analyses of all the data, and also discourse and discursive approaches to analysis to really look particularly at the case examiner's decision rationales at that end of the investigation stage to see how they construct their decisions, the language that they use. So the methods that we used, we conducted a narrative review of sort of relevant literature from a number of different disciplines, including academic and grey literature. I'm not going to say too much about that today for time reasons, but there were some interesting findings across different professions really out of that review, including law, kind of looking at solicitors regulation, the police, and also wider healthcare professions that showed kind of these trends in disproportionality are seen across a lot of different professional groups, so it's by no means unique to kind of medicine or to the General Medical Council. We conducted semi-structured interviews with 7 members of GMC FTP staff. They were people working at those various decision points, covering kind of a range of different roles and responsibilities. And the purpose of doing those interviews really was to help us as researchers get a better understanding of how those people in those jobs actually work, rather than just kind of reading the regulations and things like that, to talk to people about what they actually do day to day. But they did throw up some interesting kind of findings and little points as well. We also reviewed the GMC's guidance and criteria documentation. That is the guidelines that they provide to their decision-making staff as to how decisions should be made and the kind of parameters for those decisions. And then the major part of the work was reviewing samples of FTP case files from each of those 3 decision points. So, for the main part of this day, I'm just going to give a brief overview of some of those findings, really. So the interview participants we spoke to generally felt happy in their work and well supported in their roles, and kind of comfortable with their decision-making responsibilities. And although they said that much of the decision-making work they did was done individually, some of them also talked about feeling able to discuss issues with their colleagues if they were finding something difficult, if they weren't sure. These discussions raised an interesting point because they happened both in kind of formal settings through formal case review meetings, kind of discussing case management, things like that. There's also a facility for kind of investigative staff to request what's called case advice from one of the case examiners about how a case should progress, and that's all recorded in the GMC's kind of electronic database called CBL. But our interviewees also said that sometimes they would just talk about cases kind of across the office, or ask the person at the next desk, and that's perfectly normal. People in kind of all walks of life do that. But it did raise the possibility that there is kind of an informal or unrecorded element to the kind of fitness to practice decision-making process that isn't recorded in the case files, really. The interviewees, we also asked them about how they use the guidance and criteria documentation, and they generally said that they found it very useful. But they also recognised its limitations, and that's quite important. Somebody referred earlier to kind of standards versus rules, and this idea crops up in the GMT's guidance and documentation because whilst it tries to be as comprehensive as it can, every FTP case is unique, and the decision-making staff are required to kind of consider aggravating and mitigating factors that are unique to each case. So the guidance cannot give kind of very clear directions as to what the outcome in any particular case should be. There's usually a range of possibilities. So it's not black and white, the guidance and criteria. So in looking at those guidance and criteria documents, we particularly looked for references to demographic characteristics, the protected characteristics, particularly And we found no evidence of bias or discriminatory language within the guidance and criteria documentation, no references to ethnicity or gender. There are some minor references to place of medical qualification. One of our findings also, which sounds obvious, is that the guidance and criteria documents are specific to a UK medical practice context because they're drawn from good medical practice standards for UK medical practice. That does mean that in some cases, particularly around areas such as doctor-patient relationships, shared decision-making, those things aren't universal, they're not done in the same way everywhere. So it might be that in some ways that guidance can differentiate perhaps against international medical graduates, and that's something the GMC has tried to sort of focus on. It has a kind of program, Welcome to UK Practice kind of meetings that it's kind of been piloting recently. There are also some factors which, kind of personal factors, which can be considered in decision making. Seniority or stage of career, which could be seen as a proxy for age, can sometimes be used, but more in ways that might actually favour the doctor who's older, particularly if they're seeking voluntary erasure or things like that. It's more likely to be awarded if they're going for FDB, if they're older and nearer to retirement, and more likely to be looking to permanently retire, things like that. FTP history also, of course, can be considered. And also the doctor's health is referred to quite often in the guidance and criteria documents, but again, usually in ways which are designed to try to protect doctors with ill health, sort of ensuring that they have proper legal representation and things like that in place. One finding particularly about the guidance and criteria documentation was that in places what we term threshold adjectives are used, words like serious and significant. And although there are some kind of examples of what might constitute serious or significant departures from good medical practice given, again, they're not always clear-cut, they're not always absolutely defined what those terms mean. So this kind of requires decision makers to make kind of additional sub-decisions within the wider decision about the overall case. And it just, there's this extra kind of little degree of interpretation there within the system as to whether something meets those thresholds or not. So in our kind of finding, we've stressed that it's really, really important for decision makers to kind of set out in their decision rationale kind of how they've decided that something meets those thresholds or not when they record the decision. So as I said, the major part of this work was looking at sampled case files. All the cases that we sampled had passed the relevant decision point within the previous 12 months, so between April 2013 and April 2014. We looked at 102 triage cases, 30 stream 2 cases, 55 stream 1 cases. And as I said, this was a really in-depth quantitative review. The stream 1 cases, the case files can be like 600 pages of information to go through. They can be really, really huge. And the samples that we drew were stratified samples, well, sort of semi-stratified samples, lots more sizes, but by outcome, really, decision outcome, and then by primary medical qualification, because the GMC has kind of that data for every doctor. And then also we reviewed the samples to try and ensure a good mix of other characteristics within there. So the headline finding from all this really is that within the sample case files, we didn't find any evidence of discriminatory practices or bias, or, kind of unintentional or otherwise. The decisions at each stage were in line with the appropriate range of outcomes as set out in the guidance. However, there were some cases where it wasn't entirely clear why one particular outcome, whilst it was an entirely valid and within the expected range, why that one outcome had been chosen instead of other outcomes. And in some stream 1 cases in particular, we identified a lack of clarity between the use of what is the conclude outcome and the conclude with advice outcome. In some of the conclude cases we reviewed, we found examples of the decision maker kind of offering what looked very much like advice in the decision and it not being recorded as such. Now that might just be a recording issue, but it does have potential sort of consequences if that doctor is later referred again for a similar issue and their FTP history won't show that they've already had the advice if it's not recorded properly. So again, within those stream 1 cases, the end of investigation cases, we did quite an in-depth discourse analysis of the case examiner decision rationales, as I said. Again, there's no evidence of bias or discriminatory language or practices found. The narratives are written as factual accounts, using a third-person passive voice. The case examiner narratives, what they're doing is they're synthesising all the information within the case file to produce their kind of decision rationale, their judgment at the end. So synthesising information from different sources. And although at first glance they report it as factual and as like a very clear narrative, they do sometimes use qualifying or value-laden words, which can sometimes be termed doubt raisers in discourse analysis. So things such as it appears or allegedly, which they repeatedly throughout a decision can privilege kind of the writer's preferred interpretation of events. So just to come back really in conclusion to those kind of research questions that we asked, yes, the finding is that decisions are in line with guidance and criteria documentation. As we said, there's some minor issues, and really what we stressed is that in some of the decision rationales there was a lack of clarity and a lack of detail as to why and how a decision exactly had been reached, so we kind of recommended that the GMC needs to stress that that level of detail is consistently given with references to relevant guidance and criteria where possible. And again, just this informal or unrecorded elements of the process which could raise questions if people were so inclined. So again, that thorough recording of the decision rationale and its justification is really important. So again, whilst our sample contained the same general trends within the overall data, we found no bias or discriminatory practices. And the institutional professional discourses which shape decision making in the FTP processes, again, it's UK context specific, as you'd expect. And what was interesting to us was that the voices of the case examiners came through very, very strongly throughout the case files, really, which isn't something that you quite realise if you just read kind of descriptions of the FTP process. So case examiners have quite an extensive role and quite key figures. There is this, again, this aspect around informal discussions, which obviously the staff found very constructive and helpful in helping them make decisions. So it's not that that's necessarily a negative thing. It just means that, you know, they need to be very clear about how they've reached a decision. And again, those decision rationales just need to be fully reasoned. So in conclusion, and I think the headline on the press release today is that we didn't identify any bias or discriminatory language. We've been very careful to say throughout the report that we didn't identify that within the cases that we sampled. And we're not saying that it never ever has ever happened, but within our sample it wasn't present. But we've raised some specific points around aspects of the guidance and also around aspects of the process and how decisions are recorded, with an emphasis on clarity and full reasoning. Thank you.
I'm aware that we've only got a few moments so before we start the next session, so I'd like to thank our speakers. I mean, first of all, Irwin, who gives an insight into the programme, the online self-directed programme. We've also had the work-based approach to pharmacy regulation and the different learning assessments, and an insight into the GMC processes. If you're, maybe we could have a couple of quick questions if you're willing, and then we could perhaps take some coffee into the main session. That might be the best way to maximise use of time. So if you just a few minutes if anyone has any questions.
The headline says, new research finds that GMC decisions are fair to doctors under investigation.
Yes. That's
you're an academic, are you?
Yes, I am.
Are you happy with that? I don't think you've shown that, have you?
I didn't write the headline.
Yeah,
so
it's interesting.
It's not my question.
I just wondered, because I mean, you've had quite a restricted brief and you've looked at quite a limited number of parameters. You haven't examined the actual performance or actually the interpretation of the case. So it's hard to determine that you can say it's necessarily fair. You know, you look at a case and we say at the end of it, because we've interpreted this case in X way, this is the sanction that ought to be carried out, for example. But the interpretation of the case, or how it's interpreted or looked at, hasn't been evaluated at all, as far as I can see, which is not a criticism of you. But it doesn't mean, I think most people would look at saying fair as being, you know, the whole process has been, and I don't think that's actually necessarily true from what you've done.
What we've done is look at the decision making and how the decisions are made, and in doing that we have reviewed the entire case file and mapped it back to the guidance and criteria. So if the decision outcome in that case matches what the guidance and criteria says, then that's how we've looked at it.
Yeah, so it's not looking at the interpretation of the actual case itself, it's not looking at how, you can look at a case in several different ways and conclude, therefore, that certain actions should take place. And that bit isn't the bit that's actually been looked at, as far as I can see.
We've looked at whether it's interpreted in line with the guidance and criteria, and we've looked at whether the guidance and criteria are fair from this particular perspective. There are always going to be people who are very unhappy with the fitness to practice procedures, and who don't like it. And you are right, there are very many different ways that you could look at elements of those fitness to practice procedures. So we've been very clear in our report, and I hope I've been clear today, that we're presenting findings on this particular aspect.
I can understand why I asked the question. Because you said it was on the website, so I obviously looked it up. So you raised it, but in fact, if you look at the GMC's report today, it came out a few days ago on its consultation exercise before Christmas, saying that huge support for changes. You sort of drill down, and in fact, it's 400 people who've actually responded to that, and that's the basis of the report, which kind of cites seeing there's a bit of a PR sting going on. Personally, as an academic myself, I don't like that. I just wondered because it rather impacts on being put forward as being an independent report. If people spin a report like that, and you're being paid for it as well.
Well, yes, the report was commissioned. We don't tend to work for free, so yes, it's paid from. But it is independent. It's written independently, and I mean, the GMC publishes all the research it commissions on its website, and the press releases that they put out alongside it are nothing to do with us, and we won't really count that. I haven't actually seen much of the press release, so I don't know entirely what it says.
So I'm just saying what doctors will be commenting on.
Yeah.
So maybe one final question, just before we thank our speakers for the afternoon. Well, I think I always do have some sympathy for speakers who have to come in and speak after lunch, and I think our two speakers this afternoon have excelled themselves and given us three very different, very stimulating and thought-provoking presentations. So thank you very much.